In the 55 years that I've been a spiritual seeker or spiritual student, like many of you, I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of books, attended many lectures, workshops, retreats, you name it. And in that time, I've come across several things that I found to be very useful. Shifts in perspectives or understandings that had a big impact on me. Some of these have only come about in the last 7 or 8 or 10 years. So I thought I would share them with people that are interested in the Enneagram, because I found them to be quite useful to get under the pattern of the Enneagram, to look at the forces and dynamics that help to create the patterning and to sustain the patterning. So I don't do a lot of work with the Enneagram as far as working with students or using it to type people. My interest is much more beneath the patterning. My orientation is, I think, somewhat similar to Claudio Naranjo's, in that, as he said in his book, Character and Neurosis, the Enneagram type, your Enneagram type, is all bad news. And by that he meant that it shows you what's in the way of what's real in you, your essence or essential nature. So in that regard, it's all bad news. On the other hand, it's pretty useful because it gives you a very clear, nuanced understanding of your patterning. So it's great as a tool to help open up to that initial stage of exploration and inquiry into who is this person that we take ourselves to be. So one way of looking at it is that who you are is mediating the experience of what you are. It's acting as a filter so that we aren't directly experiencing the essence or nature of what we are. These 6 insights are intended, hopefully, to take you underneath the type and give you some insight and tools to work with your clients and students and yourself to get a little deeper insight into all of that. So the first thing I want to talk about is the trap of the self. Take a moment and just experience you. Get the sense of you. The sense of the body, both the external experience of the body and the internal sense of the body. The sense of the familiarity of your thoughts and your emotions and the way you react to things, and the memories, the history, just that overall sense of you, that you that we all we step into self-exploration, spiritual seeking, take to be us. That's what we want to talk about. This sense of the self, this you that we believe has existence and agency. And we're going to challenge that during this lecture. Now, we all know, at least any of us that have read any psychology or taken Psych 101 in school or whatever, that this self, this ego, is self-centered. This self is always reflecting back on its experience with its environment or with what's going on with it, whether that's internal or external. It's always referencing itself. And consequently, this self lives in a house of mirrors. Wherever it looks, it sees itself. And by looking, I mean experiencing. And during this lecture, I'm probably going to use the word seeing a lot. And it'll be up to you to discriminate when I'm, most of the time, I'll be using it to refer to experiencing, whether I'm hearing or seeing out of my eyes or experiencing my felt sense of what's going on in my experience from the perspective of what we are, from awareness and consciousness. That is seeing. It's all one thing to awareness and consciousness. What we are doesn't have the five senses. It has capacities far beyond that. So this self that we're going to be talking about, as most of us know, because we've read quite a bit, is a constructed self. And they're proving that with neuroscience and all these nice machines they have these days where they can observe brain patterns. And it's become quite clear that when I make a decision to move my hand, take a left turn in my car, decide to have this rather than that, that decision has already happened before my thought process of choosing happens. So from that perspective, this self that we think we are isn't involved in that at all. And yet those decisions are still happening. And so that's a interesting and curious thing. Like, how's that all happening if I'm not involved in it? And by I mean the familiar sense of self. And this self, because it is constructed within a system, within a biological and psychodynamic system, can't escape the system. Nothing can escape a system that created it. And what's kind of a real hoot is that this self thinks that it can know reality, has all kinds of ideas about reality, when in fact, it can't penetrate the house of mirrors. It cannot see into reality. It cannot imagine reality. And that is something that really does not become absolutely clear until one starts experiencing reality. And then a very interesting process happens where our mind reifies that experience, meaning it conceptualizes it, turns memory and experiences into objects and files them away in our memory. And so you can have an experience of reality, and then in the future you can say, well, I've experienced reality, and you can start talking about it. But most of the time, you're not speaking from reality. You're speaking from memory. And the challenging thing for a lot of this exploration is that our brain runs us in circles, thinking it can penetrate reality. So we have this experience, this life we're living, that has two major components that we're looking at: who you are and what you are. And we're going to be using who you are to reference this self. And we're going to be using what you are to reference exactly that, what you are. So this self creates a lens, a distortion of reality. It's a filter that, that what we are is perceiving reality through. And by perceiving, again, I mean what we are, this awareness, this consciousness, this dynamism and existence of being itself is experiencing this world, this lived experience, this reality, and consequently all of reality through the filter of this self. So it's just like what we are is some kind of camera, that can perceive, and we put a lens over that camera, and that affects what shows up on the film. So the main point in all of this is self cannot get out of self. And this is one of the elements that challenges a lot of Enneagram work that's going on out there. Because people are trying to use the Enneagram to help the self get out of self. And all of that activity is just reinforcing the self. When I got on the spiritual path, I was the type of person, I was looking for the ultimate technique that would get me into reality, into a particular state where I could have a marvelous life being realized and enlightened or whatever. But it's a big disappointment for the self, because the self's not going to be around for the celebration. The self is what's in the way. To experience reality directly, that happens when the self is dissolved. So that means it happens when you're not there. And we hear that, and we read about it, and we imagine it to be something else. We think we're going to be there. Well, that's just kind of speaking at it in maybe a roundabout way or something like that. But no, it's actually spot on. When we experience reality, this you that's listening to this lecture right now isn't going to be there. So that was a big insight for me when that really landed, that the self cannot get out of self. That what you are, or better yet, you are what you're looking for. And, that directly refers to that whole dynamic of looking outside ourselves for what actually exists within ourselves. And that's another point that is interesting to make, is from the dimension of reality, from the non-dual reality, when we say inner, you need to go within. From reality's perspective, that's still part of the outer. The idea and concept we have of our inner self is really still the outer self. And so in some spiritual traditions, they talk about the inner of the inner. So it's best to handle that with a very light touch. Matter of fact, it's good to handle all of this with a light touch and just be, more than anything else, curious. Entertain it as an idea or a hypothesis and see where it takes you to just explore that. So one of the things that really brought my attention to a huge shift which had occurred in me was this understanding of mental process. So to understand that the primary function of the brain, the organic brain, part of this organism, the body-mind, its primary function is to interpret perception for the survival of the organism. And it does that in many ways that are unconscious to us. And it does that whether we like it or not. And it does that regardless of everything we do trying to stop it. So I first came across my first insights of this through meditation. When you take up meditation, well, most people, when I took up meditation, I thought meditation that I was supposed to be doing something to quiet my mind. I was supposed to be doing something that was going to take me into some other state of consciousness or something like that. And like most people that take up meditation, what I found is, my mind found it much more interesting to work on my Christmas list, to repeat about 1,000 times that I needed to do this today or that today, and just go round and round with all that, right? And I spent a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to stop that process. And then over time, you have a little bit of an experience here and a little bit of experience there. And along the way, maybe 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, I really connected with this sense of existence, this isness, this element that Nisargadatta and other people call the I am and point one to. Find the I am, find the I am. Well, my Enneagram, type 8, I was always a problem for me, problematic. To include the I in anything was problematic for me. But I could experience this sense of isness, this existence. So I forgot the I, and I just concentrated and focused on that sense of existence, which I found it very easy to find in whatever I was experiencing. And then as I meditated and moved through life, it became clear to me that all of this mental process has nothing to do with what I am. So as I was meditating and my mind would be working on my Christmas list or busying itself with a project I needed to do or something like that, it just became, I don't know, it just became very clear to me that what's that got to do with me? Let it do what it wants. Let the mind do what it wants. What's that got to do with me? That mental process, quit fighting it. Just come back to this sense of existence, this isness. And then that just started kind of nurturing the capacity to be in that state of existence more. Not to get anywhere. That too fell away. And that's a good point about the Enneagram types. The Enneagram type, these personalities, these patternings, they're all about doing and getting and acquiring and all of that. All of that activity is just about perpetuating the type, perpetuating that sense of self, which puts us in a real dilemma. So then you might say, well, what do we do? How do we work with that? Because it's a great tool. It shows us a lot. It's a great map. I found the Enneagram to be quite useful by pointing me at about 50 things I needed to look into. And that's the real key. You see, the real key is not in doing something or fixing something or fine-tuning something or moving from here to there. No, the power in transformation comes from the awareness itself, comes from the consciousness. And that is not a mental process. So when we're looking at our Enneagram type, we're looking at it through this lens, this distorted perspective. Because it can look at itself in a way. The attention can be on that patterning, on that self. But you see, the agent of change is not in that patterning. The agent of change is in the awareness and the consciousness and the dynamism that is actually looking through the lens. So the Enneagram is a great tool for seeing, not fixing, because it's the seeing that brings about the transformation. And the transformation isn't, in a way, what we really think it is. It's not going from here to there. It's more like things just become clear in a way that, oh, I'm not that patterning. And so the patterning eases up a bit, dissolves a little bit. So I want to talk some about what is this self? What is it and how did we get it? What is it that it actually gets constructed? How does that happen? So this little diagram here, that nice big solid line at the bottom represents reality, essence, the now. And you can see that the past and the future are really not connected to that ground. They don't exist within that ground. Neither does birth and death. Now, between birth and between death, you are somewhere on that timeline. And the self is oriented toward getting to someplace, getting realized or enlightened or getting more optimized, developing more capacity around this, that, or the other. That I is always living in the past, oriented toward the future. It has never spent a moment in the now, because the now would dissolve it. To really be in the now dissolves that sense of I, that who I'm taking myself to be. And that's one of the challenges about working with the Enneagram, from the perspective of working with it in a way that what I'm looking for is to fundamentally change my experience of what I'm taking myself to be and bring it more into into more immediacy with reality itself, and have that experience be opened up. Because you're going to find that you never did anything to get yourself there, not as this self. There's nothing you can do, there's nothing you've done, there's nothing you will do that makes that happen. The closest you could come to say you've been doing something that would make that happen is in exploring in great nuance and depth what it is you think you are. But that's not going to make it happen either, because the mind will turn that into a doing. So it just keeps perpetuating that activity of the self. So, what is this self? This was quite mind blowing to me. After reading all these books, watching all these videos in the last 20 years when we had, access to all this video content, when this landed, it was like, it's so simple. Yeah. Right now, in this experience you're having, listening to this lecture, is that familiar sense of self. That familiar sense of self, I wanted you to take a moment and notice before we started all this. If you notice right now, that familiar sense of self is part of this experience you're having. See? Well, that's so obvious. But here's what's not obvious. And here's what's being proven by neuroscience. Is every action like moving that arm that I talked about? All of that happens, all of those decisions, all of those neurons start firing before I think I'm going to move my arm, or I'm going to do this, or I want to think about this. And what happens is, as experience, as reality starts to unfold this moment into the next moment, as just that, the unfolding of reality, part of my experience is that it includes this familiar sense of self. But that recognition by the mind lags behind all of that initiating impulse and what have you that's happening unconsciously. So this familiar sense of self gets attached and incorporated into the experience after the experience starts unfolding. I mean, it's nanoseconds, it's almost instantaneous, so we don't notice it. And then the way that the mind works, because we have a comparative mind. If you go to the dictionary and you look up a word, it's going to define that word using other words. And if you go look up one of those words, it's going to, and eventually you're going to wind up using this word to define those other words. It's just this circular comparative logic that's happening. So we have this comparative mind, and this experience is unfolding, and there's this sense of familiarity that's immediately part of it, and the mind connects this moment of familiarity with the last moment and the last moment and the last moment, and it creates this thread through time of these moments of familiarity. And it makes an assumption, because that sense of familiarity has been here through time, that it exists. That familiarity exists. It has existence. And because it's all so instantaneous, it says it has agency, but it doesn't. Because that sense of self didn't even exist when you were 2 years old. And yet that little body ran around and ate and made noise and did all kinds of things. And it did it with no self. But the mind projects the self beyond that right back to birth. It says, I was here. Nope. That self is constructed by that very simple process we're talking about. This self we're taking ourselves to be is just memory. It's an idea we have of what we call us. And we have this story, you see, it creates this story. And it's always massaging the story to go into the future, to fine tune and change things, to make a better life, to have a better experience in the future, you know. And that means in order to imagine a better future, I have to be living in the past because I'm working through a dualistic comparative mind that's comparing the experience I'm having or had with an idea or a fantasy of something that could be better, and it's trying to move me toward that. You see, in our patterning, our Enneagram just gives us the huge history on that and gives us insight into how our awareness is working, what grabs our attention, what are some of the motivating dynamics. So, to come back to seeing, not fixing or doing, that the power of the transformation is in awareness and consciousness itself. As our attention is focused and looks into this self we're taking ourselves to be, this patterning, as we're exploring that Enneagram patterning, and we get curious about looking deeper than the patterning itself, the idea we have of ourselves starts to dissipate. And that brings us closer to that ground of being. So, spiritual work is more a regression than a progression. When we were born, we were totally in touch with our essentialness, our beingness, and that got covered up by this filter that gets created. So, what we're attempting to do through spiritual work is dissolve this filter, which is a regressive process. We're not going anywhere. We're just clearing up the filter. We're lifting that filter off. But that experience in itself feels like a regression because we're kind of going back to younger places in ourselves, younger, whether it's one day or whether it's 20 years. We're, we're peeling the onion, we're polishing the mirror, we're going back and back and back. And when we get to the point where the whole thing lifts off, it becomes abundantly clear. It's so obvious that what you are has been here all along. It was always here and is always going to be here. It is actually what has existence, what's having this experience that we call our life. And it's never been chipped or marred or wounded or anything else. It exists in its purity right now, regardless of our history of this body. So how's this thing get created? That is something that we should look at. And one of the ways we can look at it is by exploring one of the ways that the mind organizes experience. Now, to have experience, there needs to be an observer, a perspective, an experiencer, and there has to be something being experienced. There has to be an other. So that other can be a person, can be going out to dinner, can be thinking about the Enneagram, can be my idea of God. There's always you and the other. Otherwise, there's no experience. So I use this example to try to help people taste how this all begins. And what I normally do is I put on some music, really soothing music, and I take people on kind of a guided meditation. You know, the music is playing. I'm just saying, relax, be where you are, take some breaths, let it go. You know, think of the perfect summer day. Temperature's just right. There's a soft breeze. The air is warm. It's just right. They're butterflies. There's a baby, soft and has that baby smell, that baby powder smell. Maybe somebody's baking bread. There's that, it's a sensory delight. And then I just say rape. After I get you all relaxed and sensitive and everything's just good, rape hits your consciousness. And then I go back to Bambi and the butterflies, and then I ask people, like, what happened? What was your experience when the word raped dropped into it? And I use rape because it's a violent word. And invariably, people will say they were shocked. It actually startled them. Their body jerked, their mind jerked, whatever. And my response is great. That's exactly what I wanted to happen. Because that's the foundation of you, of this sense of self. So some of this patterning happens in utero because the organism is reacting to the environment and the mother's experience and emotional state and what have you. But just think of it from the time you're born and you're this sensitive little ball of protoplasm. And when I talk sensitive, I'm talking, maybe 1,000 times more sensitive than you are right now. Because in the process of living, we've all been dumbed down and insulated. But when you're born, right now you can notice that you can feel the air, like the temperature of the room. If there's any air movement at all, you can feel that. If you move your arm, you can feel the shirt sleeve. So this baby comes into the world and its body starts experiencing all these impressions from the outside. And it's very, very sensitive. And this is why Freud says your ego is fundamentally a body ego, because that construction of the ego begins right here, ground zero, with being that sensitive. And Freud also says that the ego is fundamentally a defensive structure. It's a coping mechanism that gets created through trial and error of trying to survive in the environment we find ourselves in. And by coping, it's like, how do I deal with this? Which is usually some kind of contracted, I need to manipulate myself or put myself in a pretzel to deal with whatever. Right? But imagine this baby, brand new baby, yeah, just sitting there, and oh, it's all sweet and delighted, just ate. It's just everything's perfect for it. Unfortunately, this family lives about 6 blocks from a fire station, and somebody calls the fire department, and that engine comes out and goes and comes roaring down the street, and this baby goes just like you did when I threw that word in there. It reacts. It reacts. It's shocked. Its whole system is shocked. And those of you that have children know that with an infant, what you see, that is what the child is experiencing internally and subjectively. It hasn't discriminated its emotions and its thought process from its body yet. That reaction is the emotional experience of the baby, is the psychological state of the baby. It's that. Okay. Now, this fire truck comes by, let's say, 5 times a day at least. Okay. So there's this repetitive pattern that starts happening. And the organism, because there's not a mind yet that susses all this out, the organism itself, the body, starts laying the patterning in reaction to the sound. And it gets very good at it. Hears that first, and it tenses up right away because it knows what's coming. So it's tensing up to protect itself, to cope with the external environment. And then after it's lived on that street for a couple of years, it doesn't wait for the first sound of the siren. It's carrying a tension pattern that's in place permanently now to protect itself from being surprised by that. And that patterning we're holding starts being part of the experience of how I relate to things as the personality becomes more and more complex and finally leads us to a patterning that we call an enneatype. So in between that patterning and these initial shocks or reactions that we have in our environment, someplace out around 2 years of age, as we start experiencing ourselves as a separate individual, we've gone through that process of separation individuation, okay? Because it's become quite clear in this body that this body isn't my mommy's body. There's me and there's mom. So once that process is really kind of fairly well developed, my relationship with the world and the way things are happening in my mind, we get back to there's me and there's the other. So it's no longer we, mom and me, it's mom and me. And the experiences I have with mom fairly quickly in life get split into good and bad. There's good mom and there's bad mom. And we all like good experience better than we like bad experience. The body is the biological organism is part of that because Good experiences usually mean better chances of survival. Bad experiences, not so much. So we start leaning to good experiences and what have you. And as we get more history and we encounter new experiences with dad, with siblings, with my uh, kindergarten teacher, whatever it is, because we have a comparative mind and because the mind uses these object relations to help organize and define experience, the mind goes, oh, this reminds me of this. So it grabs this experience from the past that has the same emotional, energetic charge that connects me to the other. And it says, this is like this. And it projects the past onto this experience, saying, this is just like this. I know what's going on here. And these type of structures in the brain, these object relations, they are underneath that enneatype, underneath that patterning. They're the foundations of what creates that patterning. So when you look at like an Enneagram type 8, and the Enneagram type 8 likes to be independent, likes to be strong, doesn't want to be needy, it's very easy to, first of all, separate those. That's a good experience for an 8, that's a bad experience for an 8. You know, that 8, for whatever reason, is going to try to have more of the positive experience than the negative experience, right? And you can ask yourself, what created that preference? And there's a lot of information in there about how some of that gets created for the types, the different childhood environments and forces that were at work. But to recognize that those forces are being driven by these object relations, which are just ideas again. They're just ideas that are being held on to. So our experience is never really in the moment, like, this is brand new. This hasn't happened before. What's this? That type of curiosity and openness isn't in the experience of the personality, because that type of openness and curiosity can only be experienced in the now. And the ego self, the personality, the Ennea type patterning is never in the now. So, to bring this awareness, to bring our consciousness below the surface of the patterning, to start looking at the foundational pieces of what is actually creating that patterning, okay, allows that awareness and consciousness to see through these object relations. And again, by seeing through, I'm talking about experiencing them again, experiencing the reality of them in our mind, and how that idea is actually manifesting and has been in our experience as tension in the body, is tension in the mind, that we're holding that patterning, and holding that patterning has created beliefs about ourselves and the world. And you can bring all of the positive affirmations and everything you want to throw at all of that, and it won't touch it a bit, because all of this is at a really deep subconscious level. These beliefs uh, have way more power than any conscious thought I'm going to throw at it. So as an Enneagram teacher or therapist or whatever, anyone that's working with clients or students and using the Enneagram, this is useful information. This is a way to get underneath the patterning, to understand a little more intimately what's going on. It doesn't mean you have to, have a great understanding of object relations theory. It would help. Doesn't mean you have to explain it all to your client or student, but it's helpful to have the perspective. It's helpful to be able to assist your student and client to bring their attention to the patterning and then below the patterning, because you know that the more that they can bring their awareness and their consciousness and their attention to this and the dynamism of the existence of what they are to that, eventually they're going to open up and they're going to see it from a different place. They're going to experience it from a different place. And that's where the transformation happens, because something isn't changing into something. Something is dissolving and the experience is changing. And another thing comes in here, which is affective nuclei, which is another way that the brain organizes and stores information. So in these object relations, when I get an object relation that has an emotion or an energy or a charge that is like angry, every experience I have that involves that emotion and that energy gets placed into a particular filing cabinet marked anger, pissed off, whatever, right? Sad, you know, blue. And then something happens that triggers that emotion. And because I have a comparative mind, it grabs that filing cabinet drawer and dumps my entire history with that into the moment. And so we get this big overreaction. It's easy to see with anger, but you can also see it very clearly with withdrawal. People just go, they're a zillion miles away instantaneously. They're hurt to their core. So knowing this gives us some capacity to bring more ground to our students and our clients. We may need to do some things to mediate the intensity of the moment, which is totally disconnected from what's really happening. But we're reacting with such intensity that there's no hope to really start trying to work in a conscious way to bring more focus to look at things. So we may have to work a little bit with discharging energy or stabilizing things. That, and again, understanding the personality type, understanding the underlying forces can help with that process. So then the other thing that really helped was working with the superego, because the superego is not going to let anyone change if it can help it. The primary role of the superego is to keep you within the realm of the known, keep you within that familiar sense of self. Don't go out of bounds. And one of the ways it does this is through the ego ideal. I mean, if you just close your eyes right now and imagine hitting a Powerball, a lottery, and your take home after all the taxes and everything is $100 million. Now you could have the life that you really want. You can have a life that is the way things should be. You can just feel into that. Life should be like this. I should be like that. Other people should be like this. You can get this feeling of that ideal. And it is that idealized self-image, worldview image that is motivating that personality structure, motivating that Enneagram type. But when we're dealing with the ego ideal, we're dealing with the ego, the sense of self. We're not living in reality. We're living in a fantasy. And these days we know we're living in a dopamine loop. We're living in the world of neurotransmitters and chemicals. So the superego is this image shows there's an object relation in this head because the superego is just an object relation. There's me and there's the other. There's me and there's this voice in my head. Should do this, don't do that. And we spend a lifetime messing with this thing, trying to get it to shut up and leave us alone. And we're never going to win an argument. We're damned if we do and damned if we don't. Oh, you should be like this. So you try being like that. Oh, man, you really screwed that up. You shouldn't be doing it that way. You know, you can't win. So the way that we work with it in the diamond approach is we just get it the hell out of our immediate experience. Just go away. Take a hike, Mike. You know, I want to become so interested in my immediate experience that when we go back to that timeline where I'm standing there facing the future and I've been spending a lifetime of trying to change and adapt the future to what I want it to be according to my ego ideal, I want to take that arrow, instead of having it point to the future, I want it to point straight down into right now. I want to bring my attention, my awareness, my consciousness right now. What's going on right now? I don't need the superego giving me advice on anything. All of the advice over the years was probably pretty good when I was 4 or 5 years old, probably saved my life. Yeah. 10 or 12 years old, maybe not so much. 16, maybe it's back full gear, But now it's basically 99% bullshit that's in the way. It's just making me feel bad about myself. It's reinforcing all of this ego activity to try to be something else. So what I want to do is get it out of the room. I want to explore my experience right now without any help from it. And to begin working on that superego, the first thing we need to discover is that voice isn't ours. We think it's ours because it sounds same thing, same voice that's happening in our head all these years. Okay? But if you can identify the exact message, the words it's using against you, and you can identify this object relation, there's me and there's this voice and it's saying this, who is that? Because this isn't the first time I've heard this. And I want to get really sensitive and in tune with that force, with that pressure. Like, who is that? And it'll be very clear that That's not you. And then you can begin working with it a little more effectively. And the other thing about these object relations, you'll notice that you are always small and the other is always big. That's because when these things start forming, you were small. The other was big. The world was big. Dad was big. Mom was big. Mom was smarter. Dad had more money. Whatever it is, there's some kind of lack or deficiency over here that is internalized that something's wrong with me later on in life, when in fact it's just because that whole thing got put in place when you actually were smaller, when you hadn't developed yet and didn't have all the capacities you have now. So these are 6 things, I think there's 6, that working with these, discovering these, having these land in me, where like that understanding of what the self is, when that landed in me, I mean, you could just feel that the experience was everything just realigned. And you could feel it. I could feel the consciousness in my mind and my body felt the adjustment to that insight. And then to have the lens allow that perception to be in my everyday experience now, it's been life changing. So that is it for now. If you'd like to know more about this or explore it more, reach out to me. I'll have my email at the end of this video. Thanks for taking the time.